In this module, we will cover the basics of magnetic source imaging. Basically, it means the reconstruction of the current sources in the brain from the recorded neuromagnetic fields and superposition of the results on the MR image of the brain. In this presentation, we will introduce the most basic concepts for what is magnetic source imaging, equivalent current dipole, the forward and inverse problem, spherical and realistic head models, single and multiple dipole sources, and distributed sources. In the previous modules, we learned how the neuromagnetic signals are generated by neuronal currents. Basically, a summation of currents of many neurons with the same direction can be mimicked as one strong dipole when we measure the electromagnetic fields at some distance from the neurons. This net activity is termed as the equivalent current dipole, ECD. An ECD is a mathematical abstraction and generates the same magnetic field as an infinitesimally short line current. It can be thought to represent the activation of about a 1 centimeter squared patch of cortex. An ECD is represented by parameters describing its position, orientation, and strength. The dipole parameters can be fitted to the measured data in a least squares sense. That is to say that the measured field pattern is compared to the predicted field for an ideal current dipole, and the squared differences are computed channel by channel. The dipole location is obtained by iteratively moving the dipole until the squared sum of differences is minimized. This method can be used to fit single or multiple dipole sources. The ECD is the most common source model used in the analysis of MEG and EEG data. As we learned, primary and return currents generate an electric potential everywhere in the head and a magnetic field which extends outside of the head. The forward problem means that we need to calculate the magnetic field for MEG sensors when we have set the location, amplitude, and orientation of one or several equivalent current dipoles mimicking the primary currents. The forward problem always has a unique solution, because we can have precise information about the conductivity, geometry, and conductivities of the different tissues in the head, and therefore we can calculate the MEG signals from this primary current distribution. In the inverse problem, the task is to estimate the unknown primary currents from the MEG measurement. This is our usual case in MEG. We have the data and we would like to know what kind of a primary current distribution underlies the recorded MEG data. Unfortunately, the inverse problem does not have a unique solution, because we can always add silent current sources which do not produce electromagnetic fields. We can, however, try to solve the problem by setting additional constraints for estimating the active areas of the primary currents. Some of the commonly used constraints are discussed in the following slides. Solving the constrained inverse problem requires that we first define the source and head models, and can calculate the forward solution for these. Spherical conductor models of the human head have been applied in MEG and EEG studies since the first MEG experiments in 1972. A homogeneous sphere is a special volume conductor in MEG and EEG. When observed outside of the sphere, we see that any radially oriented dipole perpendicular to the sphere surface does not generate any magnetic field. When the dipole is rotated to have a tangential orientation, parallel to the surface, MEG signal appears outside of the sphere. In the spherical model, MEG signals arise purely from tangentially oriented dipoles. Furthermore, it should be noted that the magnetic field radial component, the flux perpendicular to the sphere surface, does not depend at all on the electrical conductivity. EEG arises from both radial and tangential dipoles and depends upon the conductivity profile. The spherical head model is considered to be sufficient for most MEG studies that will employ the use of ECD fitting. The origin of the sphere is usually determined by fitting a sphere to points placed on the inner boundary of the cranium, favoring the regions with the expected activity. The radius of the sphere is not important, but the origin matters. If the patient's MRI is not available, the origin of the sphere can be estimated because of the physical constraints of the MEG helmet. In that case, x equals 0, y equals 0, and z between 40 and 50 millimeters would be a reasonable estimate for the origin. There are more realistic head shape models that can be used which take into account individual head geometry. These are known as boundary and finite element models, known as BEM and FEM respectively. These usually employ a subject-specific model based upon the individual head geometry. They can be used where improved localization accuracy is required, particularly for inferior temporal, prefrontal, and deep sources. They are derived by segmenting structural MRIs for different tissue types and then triangulating the resulting surfaces, typically thousands of triangles per surface. These methods are both more time-consuming and computationally intense than the spherical head model. Let's review how the magnetic field and electric potential patterns look for tangential and radial dipoles. A tangential dipole, shown here with the yellow arrow, generates a bipolar pattern both in MEG and EEG. The upper MEG map represents the radial flux component through the helmet-shaped sensor array. The bipolar or dipolar map pattern is consistent with the right-hand rule when the thumb points in the direction of the arrow. The other fingers of the right hand indicate how the magnetic field curls around the dipole. The lower EEG map for the same current shows a surface potential pattern which is also bipolar, but rotated by 90 degrees from the corresponding MEG pattern. When the dipole is rotated to radial orientation, that is, the current is flowing directly towards the center of the sphere, represented here by the red circle filled with green, MEG signals vanish in a spherical head, and MEG sees very little signal in the displayed BEM geometry. The EEG, in this case, will show a monopole pattern, one pole directly above the radial source and the other pole diametrically opposite from our viewpoint. A tilted source has both radial and tangential components. Thus, MEG sees only the tangential dipole contribution. Even though the current dipole has the same amplitude and location as for the tangential and radial dipole, the field pattern appears weaker due to the silent radial dipole. In contrast, EEG sees both contributions, and in practice, the radial dipole has stronger contribution in the EEG maps than the tangential dipole. Let's have a look at a single dipole model. A single dipole model is often applied as the first source imaging approach. It assumes that just one source can explain all of the signals measured. The location of the dipole is based on one point in time. Given this constraint, the amplitude and orientation of the dipole can be estimated across a time span. The dipole tries to explain the measurements by only varying the strength and optionally also the orientation if it is allowed to change. The single dipole model does not perform well if there are two or more simultaneously active regions. Auditory experiment is a good example for this, because even in monoraurally presented experiments, the auditory cortices on both hemispheres will be activated, and the single dipole fitting would place the dipole in the center of the brain. It is possible to further constrain the analysis by selecting a subset of the sensors. For example, selecting only sensors over the active cortex region of one hemisphere will usually produce a plausible dipole location. If we consider the measured signal to be the result of multiple dipoles, then our analysis will account for multiple sources in separate regions that are either active simultaneously or sequentially. A multi-dipole model can simply be a collection of single dipoles at different locations. The time course of the dipoles can then be obtained by fitting the amplitudes, that is, the variation of their magnitudes as a function of time. In principle, the locations of two or more simultaneously active dipoles can be fitted at once in a multi-dipole position fit. In practice, this is often a difficult task. A full dipole fit, including dipole positions and amplitudes, can give us improved localization accuracy because the contributions of all the sources to the measured signals are simultaneously taken into account. Dipole models can provide a useful approach to magnetic source imaging when we know, for example, from the physiology, that there are few focal sources which can explain the measured signals. Thus, the basic assumption of dipole models is that a small number of focal dipole sources, typically less than 5 or about 10 at most, that maintain their positions and may have fixed orientations or can change their orientations throughout the time window of interest, 50 to 400 milliseconds. A research example is presented on the right. Somatosensory evoked fields were modeled with a 4-dipole approach. First, a single dipole source was sought by fitting it at 20 milliseconds and selecting only the channels above the left somatosensory cortex S1. Then, another single dipole fit was performed at 35 milliseconds, showing a nearby location to the first dipole. Two more dipoles were fit at later latencies, representing the S2 areas on both hemispheres. Finally, all 4 dipoles were applied simultaneously to find their amplitude curves. The orange trace represents the 2-dipole model, and the yellow trace represents the 4-dipole model. The bottom frame shows the goodness of fit, G, which is significantly improved for latencies after the first 40 milliseconds when 4 dipoles are applied instead of 2. When we do not have the presumption that there is a limited number of source regions, or even if the activations are focal or more spread, then the approach is to apply distributed source models with a much larger number of elementary sources than the number of channels. These methods are for research only. The brain is then divided into a uniform or non-uniform source point grid filling the whole cranium with an elementary source dipole at each location. The grid locations can then be scanned one by one or all at the same time. An example of such scanning approach is multiple signal classification, known as music. Alternatively, when individual MRI data are available, the cortical surface can be segmented and the elementary sources can be constrained so that their orientations are normal to the local cortical surface. With 7 mm spacing along the grey matter sheet, this would equate to approximately 6,000 elementary source locations on the cortical surface. In minimum norm estimation, the activities at all source locations are estimated simultaneously, and cortical constraining provides a powerful a priori information to find the primary source locations. The minimum norm estimates can be further elaborated by noise normalization methods, for example in dynamic statistical parametric map technique, or DSPM, and standardized low-resolution electromagnetic tomography, or S-Loretta. Yet another approach to distributed source imaging is provided by beamformers, which are spatial filters adapted to the measured data. The workflow for magnetic source imaging is essentially the same for all of the methods we have described. Once the MEG or EEG measurement has been performed, the signal should be processed to remove artifacts and improve the signal-to-noise of the signal components of interest. Using the method of choice, single or multi-dipole or distributed sources, estimate the primary current distribution or its statistic given the MEG, EEG data, and finally, visualize the sources by superimposing the source estimates onto the anatomical MRI. The manuals that come with your MEG system contain important information about using your MEG, including safety warnings. You must familiarize yourself with this material before operating your MEG.